The galaxy knew Earth, but it did not truly respect Earth. For generations, humanity had worked hard to build a simple, peaceful reputation. They were a quiet member of the Ether Pact, a large group of species that believed in rules and slow, steady progress. Humanity had learned hard lessons from its own long history of wars. They had finally stopped fighting each other and chose to show the stars a face of calm, careful civilization. They wanted to prove they were no longer a danger to anyone. This quiet way of life had brought them great technology and a feeling of safety, but it also made them seem soft to the powerful empires in the dark. The attack came with no warning. It was sudden. It was total. It happened in the early morning across all time zones. The hegemon fleet, the aggressive military of the Draconis Commonwealth, did not bother with any formal declarations. They did not send a single ship with a message of war. They simply ignored every single treaty and every rule the Ether Pact held dear. They flew past Earth's outer defense layers as if they were made of paper. The hegemons had two main targets. One was the massive power centers and continental energy grids that kept the world running. The other, and far more important to millions, were the research stations orbiting the planet. These stations held the best minds in medicine, physics, and propulsion. They were the future of humanity. The loss of the orbital hub, known simply as Nova, was the deepest blow. Over 60,000 scientists, engineers, and support staff lived and worked there, suspended peacefully above the troubles of the world. Chloe was a power systems engineer herself. She sat in her small, crowded apartment in Chicago watching the television. The local news channel had turned into a mandatory global emergency feed. The picture was shaky and flickering, but the words running along the bottom of the screen were clear and impossible. Orbital hub lost. She was waiting for a message from her brother, Ben. He worked on Nova, helping manage the station's complex power systems. He had promised to call her that evening to talk about a new project. Instead of a call, she saw the live satellite feed of the attack, which had been captured by a distant monitoring station just before it was destroyed. It was too fast to understand. One moment, the brilliant, intricate ring of the Nova station was hanging in the black sky above the gentle curve of the Earth. The next, a thin, needle-like ship flashed past, moving too quickly for the eye to track. The station did not explode in a fireball. It simply turned into a silent, spreading cloud of white-hot vapor and debris. It was complete and absolute. The feed cut out, replaced by a simple, repeating emergency logo. Chloe didn't cry right away. She felt a terrible, cold, empty pain settle in her chest. It was heavy and immediate, like a stone had been dropped inside her. She kept staring at the blank screen, waiting for the system to correct itself. She didn't want to believe that Ben was gone. He was always so careful, so full of plans. He had talked about the big vertical garden he was growing on the station's lower deck. He was supposed to show her pictures next week. Then a new message broke through the chaos. It wasn't from Earth Command. It was a formal, chilling broadcast from the hegemon fleet itself. The image showed a large, armored alien figure, its face cold and its posture stiff. It spoke in a smooth, mechanical voice that was instantly translated into perfect English. The message was short and cruel. "We are the hegemon. We have observed your world. This conflict was a necessary pruning of obsolete sentimentality." That phrase, obsolete sentimentality, it hurt worse than the death. The hegemons hadn't attacked because Earth was a true military threat. They had attacked because they saw humanity's push for peace and rules as a weakness, a useless, old-fashioned feeling they could simply cut away. They had shown open, casual contempt for decades of effort. The shock that settled over the world was deeper than the physical damage to the power grids. It was the shock of absolute violation.
Every rule humanity had respected, every treaty signed, every limitation placed on their own terrible weapons, every effort made to be fair, all of it had been thrown back in their faces. They had spent generations building an image of a civilized species, only to learn that civilization was just a name for their own prison of rules. In every city, in every shelter, the same bitter, new thought began to grow sharp and clear. The galaxy did not respect peace, it only respected power. By choosing to be gentle, by choosing to follow the rules, humanity had simply made itself an easier target. They had been exposed as fatally vulnerable. The air across the continents was thick with dust and sorrow. But beneath the sorrow, a new, hard feeling was taking root. The old way was gone. The simple idea of being civilized had cost 60,000 lives in a single cold flash. Earth had paid the price for its good behavior. It was a price no one was willing to pay ever again. The time for rules had ended the moment the enemy broke them.
Days after the massacre, the world was still shaking. The dust and the grief had not settled. The remaining leaders of Earth met in the deepest, most shielded place they had, the Emergency Planetary Council bunker, hidden deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. This was a place built for the end of the world, and now it felt exactly like that. The room was large, but the air felt heavy and thick. Normally, this council had dozens of representatives, all ready to argue and debate every small detail. Now, only a few essential figures were present. They sat around a long, dark table. The lights were kept low, making the room feel like a cave. The faces of the people there were tired and drawn, showing weeks of no sleep and too much horror. President Alex, who led the council, sat at the head of the table. She was known for her calm voice and her ability to make peace. She had spent her life as a diplomat, always finding a middle way, always choosing to talk instead of fight. She had been the main champion of the very treaties the hegemon fleet had just burned to ashes. She wore a simple gray uniform, and her face was pale. On the main tactical display, the casualty figures for the Nova orbital hub were still blinking. 60,000 lives. Not soldiers, not enemies, but scientists and peaceful people. Alex stared at the number, but she no longer saw a statistic. She saw the failure of her life's work. She saw her own mistake. She had believed that being good was enough. The head of the remaining military, a gruff old man named Gary, cleared his throat. "Madam President," he began, his voice rough, "we have less than 40% of our orbital defense left. We are following the Aether Pact's mutual defense protocols, but aid is still weeks away, and we cannot guarantee—" Alex lifted one hand, a small, tired gesture that instantly silenced the room. She did not look at Gary. She looked at the tactical display, at the cold, hard names of the star systems that had promised to protect them but had failed. She had fought to keep Earth gentle. Now that gentleness was a hole in the ground, a vacuum in space, and a grave for 60,000. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, and it did not shake. It was just terribly, terribly cold. It was the voice of a person who had just buried everything they believed in. "The Aether Pact," President Alex said, pronouncing the words slowly, as if tasting something foul. "The pact speaks of proportionate response. It requires formal warnings. It demands we use only certain types of weapons, only against military targets." She paused. Every person in the room held their breath. The hegemons used none of those rules. They did not send a warning. They hit our most peaceful station, and they called our decency obsolete sentimentality. She stood up slowly. Her diplomat's chair scraped against the concrete floor, the sound harsh in the silence. She walked to the display, and with a few quick taps of her finger, she made the 60,000 casualty number flash brighter, a brilliant, angry red. "We are done being civilized," she stated.
It was not a shout of anger. It was a simple, final declaration of fact. It meant the end of an era. She turned to the small circle of leaders. The pact is void. The treaties are meaningless. They broke the rules first. From this moment on, we will fight them using only one rule: survival. The council members looked at each other. Some looked afraid, but most looked relieved. The burden of being good had been too heavy to bear. Alex leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. We are throwing out the entire book. We will not offer warnings. We will not worry about collateral damage. Proportionate response is nullified. If they take a life, we will take 1,000. If they hit a station, we will take their entire planet's production. She looked directly at a young officer taking notes. Find every piece of forbidden technology, every weapon we outlawed because it was too indiscriminate, every trick our ancestors used in the bad old days. We are going to dust them off, we are going to make them better, and we are going to use them all. Our only goal is to make sure that no one, for all time, ever thinks of touching this world again. It was a dark, terrible decision. It meant throwing away the moral high ground Earth had worked so hard to climb. But the 60,000 voices from Nova had screamed a truth louder than any diplomatic protocol. Peace meant nothing without the strength to defend it without mercy. Earth had chosen to become the thing the galaxy had feared it could be, simply because being kind had failed.
The declaration from President Alex hung over the world like a shadow. We are done being civilized. That terrible freedom, the right to fight without rules, brought both a deep relief and a fresh wave of fear. The military forces remaining on Earth were disorganized. Their old playbooks were useless. They had trained for a controlled, legal fight, but this was a war for simple survival. But where the military hesitated, the scientists and engineers found a new, dark focus. They were the ones who had built the peaceful world, and they were the ones who now had the skill to tear down the enemy's world. They were fueled by the cold fact that the people who died on Nova were their own, their colleagues, their friends, their family. Captain Ethan was the man chosen to lead this new, merciless effort. He was a brilliant man, a master of weapons design, but he had always been kept on the edges of the old system. His designs were too powerful, too costly, or, most often, simply too cruel for the rules of the Aether Pact. Now, those old marks of disgrace were his qualifications. He was given near absolute power over what remained of Earth's orbital fleets and all of its secret research. He did not smile or thank anyone. He just got to work. His office was now a vast, cold warehouse in a desert facility, where the lights never turned off. His first action was to ignore defense completely. Everyone else was preparing bunkers and shields. Ethan ordered an immediate, ruthless offensive. The small, surviving exploration vessel, the Unity, was all they had left in high orbit that could travel fast and far. It was the pride of the solar exploration program, a ship built to find life, not to end it. Ethan ordered the ship brought in for retrofitting. The large, gentle instruments designed to measure space radiation and atmospheric particles were ripped out. In their place, technicians installed dense, heavy slabs of metal and complex shielded compartments for illegal energy storage. The Unity was not just being fixed, it was being violated, turned from a symbol of peace into a silent, waiting killer. Chloe, the power systems engineer who had watched her brother Ben vaporize, did not wait for an assignment. She volunteered for Ethan's team. She found him in the cold warehouse, standing over a massive, unidentifiable piece of machinery.
Her eyes were dry, her expression completely blank. "I know power," she told him, her voice flat. "I designed the energy distribution for the last 3 orbital arrays, including Nova." Ethan looked at her, seeing not grief, but the sharp, hard edge of a perfect technical mind that had been broken and remade into a weapon. He gave her a job that no one else wanted, turning the massive solar collector technology, the things that had been built to power the future Martian colonies, into a device of destruction. Chloe worked without rest. She used her knowledge of gravitational mechanics, which she had once applied to keeping satellites stable, and twisted it. The collectors were huge, miles wide, and designed to gather every tiny photon of light. Chloe figured out how to use that stored energy to create intense, temporary gravitational distortions. It wasn't a laser beam, it was a silent, sudden field of crushing force that could tear a metal ship apart simply by changing the physics around it. It was cruel, clean, and impossible to trace with current military sensors. It was exactly what Earth needed. The team's first real strike, however, was much simpler and much more deadly in its disregard for rules. Ethan's engineers took an old probe, made it nearly invisible to common radar, and replaced its research equipment with a single, small, incredibly dense kinetic payload, a solid piece of tungsten metal. This weapon had been outlawed centuries ago because it didn't discriminate between a soldier and a civilian. It was simply a tiny, fast bullet designed to travel at nearly the speed of light. The target was the Hegemon Forward Operating Base near Jupiter, a station they thought was perfectly safe, well outside of Earth's conventional reach. The launch day was quiet. There was no countdown, no fanfare, no grand speeches. The probe was ejected from the repurposed Unity with a silent burst of magnetic force. It was just a piece of metal, a messenger of pure, focused hate, traveling out into the blackness. It carried no signal, no message, only its own deadly, inevitable momentum. The first act of the new, uncivilized Earth was not a loud roar of defiance, but a cold, silent murder, traveling faster than light. The wait had begun.
The Hegemon Forward Operating Base, called Station 7, floated calmly near the rings of Jupiter. It was a place of total power and arrogance. The Hegemons, a species that looked like armored insects, believed they were the smartest and strongest. They thought the humans were a soft target, easy to bully and conquer. Commander Krell, the officer in charge of the base, felt completely safe. His species had spent centuries fighting polite, rule-bound wars. They knew exactly what a missile looked like, what a laser blast felt like, and where the enemy would place their defenses. Earth, they believed, had shown their best weapons and defenses during the massacre of Nova. Krell was in his command center, reviewing logistics. The room was stark and metallic, filled with the low hum of powerful generators. His team was bored. Their job was simple: wait for the next wave of ships to arrive from the homeworld, then finish the job on the foolish, weak humans. Then the silence broke. It wasn't a klaxon or a warning siren. It was a sudden, terrible snap. Station 7, a structure built to withstand tactical nuclear strikes, simply ceased to be functional. The tungsten slug, traveling at almost the speed of light, hit the station's core reactor. The metal probe did not explode. It released its energy purely as kinetic force. The result was an event so fast and so violent that it was over before the base's sensors could register an attack. The impact turned the entire central third of the station into a flash of plasma and vapor. The sudden, massive release of energy warped the local space before dissipating. Commander Krell did not even have time to register pain. He was simply gone. The 2 outer wings of the station were left spinning wildly in the dark.
The few hegemon soldiers who survived the initial shock were dazed and terrified. They scrambled to the emergency control centers. They needed to know what had hit them. A small, panicked investigation team began to look at the data recorders. "Report, what hit us?" demanded a surviving technician, named Jax. He struggled to breathe in the damaged atmosphere. "There is no signature, Commander," another officer reported, his voice shaking. "No plasma, no missile trajectory, no energy beam trace. Our long-range warning systems were completely silent. Our shields did not even register a brush." Jax slammed his hand down on the control panel, causing sparks to fly. "That is impossible. An entire segment of a Class A station does not just disappear. Run the timeline back. What was the last thing to cross the perimeter?" They ran the recording again, frame by frame, using the most sensitive particle detectors. All they saw was a single tiny distortion in the space fabric for less than 1,000th of a second. Then nothing but the silent spreading of wreckage. It was too small to be a weapon," Jax said, staring at the screen. The shadow was only the size of a human's fist. It was a rock. "It had the kinetic output of a heavy cruiser weapon," the other officer argued, his insectoid limbs twitching nervously. "But it left no trace, no residue. It wasn't cloaked, it was simply fast. Too fast for our current rules of engagement." The confusion was the worst part. The hegemons were used to predictable enemies. They understood war when it looked like a battle. This was not a battle. This was a murder committed by something small and invisible, a hit and run without witnesses. The attack defied their entire understanding of space warfare. The humans had not bothered with conventional weapons. They had broken the physics of the fight. Back on Earth, in the cold desert bunker, Ethan stood next to Chloe. A small light on their terminal turned from orange to green. Mission success. There was no celebration, no cheering, only a heavy silence. "They won't know what happened," Chloe said, staring at the green light. Her voice was still flat, emotionless. "They will be looking for a fleet of ships or a giant laser. They won't look for a piece of metal the size of a coffee cup." "Exactly," Ethan replied, his eyes dark with purpose. "They played by one set of rules. We just showed them that we learned a more dangerous set. They called our peace obsolete. We will show them that their own tactics are now obsolete." The hegemons, still reeling and completely unable to figure out the source of the attack, made the only logical yet terrible mistake they could make. They concluded that the humans must have gotten very lucky, or that some long-lost piece of old technology had fired once by chance. They refused to believe that the soft, polite humans had built a perfect killer. They decided to send a small, fast patrol ship closer to Earth to investigate the attack source and show their continued dominance. They still believed they were dealing with the civilized Earth they had mocked. They had no idea that they were rushing toward the mouth of a trap.
The hegemon scout ship, the Vigilance, cut smoothly through the blackness of space. It was small, fast, and full of confidence. The crew, including the commander, Vess, were still angry about the destruction of Station 7, but they were not afraid of the humans. They believed the kinetic attack was a fluke, a lucky shot. They knew exactly what Earth's public defenses looked like, and they assumed the humans were now hiding behind them, shivering. Vess sat in the pilot's chair, tapping his claws on the console. "Human space is quiet, as expected," he reported to his tactical officer. "No signs of increased fleet activity. Their sensor grid is weak. They are still operating with their ancient, polite technology." He almost sounded bored. The hegemon fleet thought of war as a clean, orderly process. They sent warnings, they used known energy signatures, and they respected the established zones of conflict. The Vigilance sped past Mars, heading toward the asteroid belt, which Earth now considered its final hidden line of defense. The humans had disguised the area well. Among the millions of rocks and debris, they had placed the vast flat panels of the repurposed solar arrays.
These panels, designed to capture light and power a future that would now never happen, were now Chloe's silent execution tools. In the deep concrete bunker on Earth, Chloe's face was close to a small private screen. The screen showed the Vigilance as a tiny dot, perfectly positioned between four of her massive, modified panels. They were deep in the asteroid field, where the hegemons expected nothing more than cosmic dust. Ethan stood behind her, watching the silence. President Alex was in the room too, observing the first use of the most powerful and most immoral weapon Earth had ever created. 3 seconds to optimal alignment, Chloe whispered. Her finger hovered over a large, unmarked black activation key. She felt nothing, no anger, no triumph, just the cold weight of the task. The death of her brother, Ben, had burned away all the softness. On the Vigilance, Vess felt a tiny, strange tremor in the ship. "Report," he snapped. "What was that?" "Minor thermal shift, Commander," the navigation officer replied instantly. "Nothing structural, probably just a piece of space debris hitting the long-range shield." Vess nodded, satisfied. Their shields were designed to shrug off such things. But it wasn't debris. It was the gravity of their own ship being suddenly and perfectly rearranged by Chloe's device. "Now," Chloe said on Earth. She pushed the black activation key. The weapon fired silently. It was not a beam of light. It was not a missile. It was a sudden, controlled, and intensely focused gravitational distortion. The solar arrays poured their stored solar energy into the distortion field, focusing a crushing wave of force directly onto the Vigilance's structure. The effect on the Hegemon ship was immediate and terrifying. The Vigilance did not explode. It simply was crushed. Vess and his crew did not hear anything. They felt a terrible, sharp pressure, like being at the bottom of a deep ocean. The metal of the ship's hull, designed to withstand deep space pressure, suddenly buckled inward. The force was applied in ways the ship's structural integrity systems were not prepared for. The front of the ship crumpled, folding like soft paper. The engines were squeezed flat, and the crew compartments were compressed into a dense, impossible knot of alloy and biology. All the air, all the light, all the life vanished in a silent 3-second collapse. It was over before the atoms even began to heat up. On Chloe's screen, the dot that was the Vigilance simply blinked out of existence, replaced by a momentary, perfectly spherical cloud of dust and debris, already starting to float apart. The gravity distortion ended, and space returned to normal, leaving behind no energy signature, no weapon remnants, and no trace of what happened. "Confirmation," Ethan said, his voice quiet but steady. "The test is complete. 100% kinetic nullification, no residual signature." President Alex slowly walked up to the screen, looking at the tiny cloud of dust that was once a powerful, arrogant enemy ship. She thought about the massacre at Nova and the 60,000 peaceful people who had died. Then she looked at the cold, hard faces of Chloe and Ethan, two of Earth's best, now twisted into instruments of pure, cold efficiency. "They will not know what to call this," Alex said. She looked around the dark room, the faces of humanity's new command team. "They will not know what rules we are playing by. They will look for ships, and we will send physics." It was the first time the hegemons had ever truly encountered something that they could not predict, something that played outside the rules of their universe. Earth had declared war not just with weapons, but with its own genius and its own terrible new lack of morals. The message was clear. Earth was no longer civilized, and the greatest difference in the galaxy was not size or strength, but humanity's willingness to use its mind without mercy. The soft planet they had intended to conquer had become the most dangerous planet in the entire sector. The hegemons were no longer investigating a weakness. They were rushing into a new, horrific fear. The war had truly begun, and Earth was playing to win, no matter the cost.